Good morning. A new year, a new programme and another wave of COVID. This time it is Omicron and we're seeing record numbers of infections but far fewer deaths than in previous waves. It is though putting intense pressure on our hospitals, on our schools and on our politicians. England, alone in the United Kingdom, is resisting calls for more restrictions. Will it pay off? Whether this is the last variant or not, one thing is becoming clear. We're going to have to learn to live with COVID. And this morning, we'll try to find out how. I'll be joined this morning by the Education Secretary, Nadhim Zahawi. How are schools coping at the start of the new term? I've been to King's College Hospital in London, which dealt with the UK's first Omicron patients, to speak to its Chief Executive, Professor Clive Kay. And I'll be talking to the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, about what Labour would do to mitigate the hundreds of pounds that will soon be added to our energy bills. Now, if you're an actor, one way to ensure you get a great role is to write it for yourself. Elizabeth McGovern, star of Downton Abbey, will be here to discuss a new play she has adapted about the life and loves of the Hollywood legend Ava Gardner. And to review the morning's papers, I will be joined by Caroline Wheeler, the political editor of the Sunday Times, and Chris Hopson, Chief Executive of NHS Providers, who speaks for the people who run hospitals across England. So, lots to fit in after the news headlines from Ben Thompson.
Sophie, thank you. Good morning. The Education Secretary, Nadhim Zahawi, has given his support to reducing the coronavirus isolation period in England. He made the comments in an interview with the Sunday Times, as our political correspondent Ben Wright reports.
At the moment, people who test positive for COVID are required to quarantine for at least 7 days. But the process is straining staffing levels in the public and private sectors. The United States recently shortened the self-isolation window to 5 days. Earlier this month, the UK Health Security Agency said doing the same here would be counterproductive, but it would keep the policy under review. In this interview, Nadhim Zahawi said that if the agency wants to cut isolation to 5 days, that would be even more helpful. Mr. Zahawi adds that he thinks the country is witnessing the transition of the virus from pandemic to endemic, meaning that the disease is a constant presence, like the common cold or flu, but no longer causing a crisis. At some point, free lateral flow tests for everyone will come to an end. But, responding to a report in the Sunday Times that this could happen within weeks, a government source said no decision had been taken and free tests would remain in place as long as they were needed.
Lawyers representing the world #1 tennis player Novak Djokovic are today appealing a decision by Australian authorities to revoke his visa. It comes after court documents released by his legal team suggested the 34-year-old had a vaccine exemption to enter the country after testing positive for the virus last month. Labour is calling for a windfall tax on oil and gas producers to help low and middle income families cope with rising energy bills. The party said the Conservatives had presided over a decade of failed energy policies. The government said the energy price cap was protecting millions from higher bills and it was supporting vulnerable households with schemes worth more than £4 billion. 3 new photographs of the Duchess of Cambridge have been released to mark her 40th birthday. The portraits that were taken by fashion photographer Paolo Raversi will go on display this year in 3 places that have a special meaning to Her Royal Highness: Berkshire, St Andrews and Anglesey. They'll then be housed in the permanent collection of the National Portrait Gallery. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Sophie, good luck. Enjoy the show. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Let's have a look at the papers. I've got 2 guests to join me to review them, but let's have a look at the front pages first of all, because with me, Caroline Wheeler and Chris Hopson, we're going to be discussing it in a moment, but these are the stories on the front pages. The Sunday Times, first of all, this is the main story written by Caroline Wheeler, who is my guest. End of free lateral flow tests as the country is told to live with COVID. It could save billions of pounds. And then the Observer, their front page, end of mass jabs and treat COVID like we do flu. This is very much the theme of the programme we're going to be talking about today, how you learn to live with COVID, if that is indeed what we're going to have to do. The front of the Mail this morning, there is the Duchess of Cambridge in glowing red. She is actually on most of the front pages this morning because it's her 40th birthday today. Their main story, though, is an exclusive "Be a True Tory, Boris, or You're Finished." This is the first interview from the former Brexit Minister, Lord Frost. And we'll be talking about that in more detail. The Sunday Telegraph, another picture of the Duchess of Cambridge, and also Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, who says, "I'll use Article 16 if the EU won't bend." The Sunday Mirror is a BBC story about EastEnders. Danny Dyer has quit, it says. The BBC show, they say, is in crisis as another top star is leaving. And finally, the Sunday Express, Home Secretary warning the Lords not to block her crime bill for victims' sake. Well, with me, Caroline Wheeler and Chris Hobson, to talk about first all of those stories. And Chris, first of all, let's go to you. Living with COVID. Lots in the papers about that. What has stood out for you?
Well, I thought the two front pages on both the Sunday Times and the Observer were really interesting, that they were looking forward, but they seem to me to be rather anticipating the fact that the current phase is still going on. And I think it's really, really difficult out there. I've written a commentary piece for the Observer this morning where I've said that London is stabilising. But if you look outside London, then there's no doubt the NHS front line is going to be stretched perilously thin. But because we are a national health service, and that's one of the great advantages of being a national health service, trusts can help each other. So I think that front line will hold. But we shouldn't underestimate the degree of pressure that many trusts are seeing in terms of they are under very, very extreme pressure in terms of, that's impacting on patient care. It's also impacting on NHS staff. And
you talk to the chief executives a lot, don't you? Just give us a really clear idea of what the situation is now like, because London was the epicentre. That is now moving, isn't it?
Yeah, it is moving to the rest of the country. And what you've got is this combination of three things at once, Sophie. You've got rising COVID cases, you've got rising staff absence in terms of, significantly due to COVID. But you've then also got that on top of the ordinary winter pressures. And don't forget, this fortnight is the busiest fortnight in the NHS calendar. So what you're having is those combinations of three things at once. And it is causing very, very significant pressure.
And is it staffing? I mean, the epicentre now is moving towards the northwest of England, the northeast of England. Is staffing the main issue rather than patients becoming really sick?
Well, we all want, don't we, a single national picture, but I think it's much better to think about it as a series of local pictures, because what's happening is in each individual place will have its own dynamics. And in some places, it's the sheer numbers of people who are coming in terms of requiring hospital treatment. And don't forget, we've got quite a few people who've got COVID incidentally. They're not in hospital because of COVID, but you still need to treat them separately and treat them differently separately from non-COVID patients. And what we're finding, as I said, in some places it's that volume that's very difficult. In other places it's the sheer volume of staff absences. But there are a number of places, and you can see that from the number of critical incidents that got declared last week, is in some places this is really difficult. But as I said, thanks to being a national health service, I think the front line will hold.
Let's talk to Caroline Wheeler, who's the political editor of the Sunday Times and has the lead story this morning, which is about COVID. End of free lateral flow tests, it says.
Yeah, what we know is that the government are now starting to look forward. I mean, I think what Chris says is absolutely right. At the moment, everybody is really focused on this wave of COVID. There's no expectation that any of this is going to happen immediately, given that we're right at the sort of epicentre of this particular wave. But actually, the government is now trying to look forward. There's a kind of general expectation now that actually this pandemic is not going to go away anytime soon. And indeed, in his interview with me, Nadhim Zahawi, the Education Secretary, was clear that we're in this for 5 to 6 years, and actually we've got to find a way of living with COVID. And what we're expecting is that the Prime Minister is going to spell out, in terms of his sort of roadmap that we've seen sort of referred to as we were in the pandemic, now a roadmap to leave that and to actually try and get back to as normal a situation as possible. And what I understand from my government sources is that there is an expectation that we're going to eventually potentially have to reduce testing, and that those lateral flow tests, which are handed out in their millions
and
to
cost
people
billions.
and cost billions of pounds, around £6 billion we discovered, which is about the equivalent of a penny on income tax, that actually we're going to have to curtail that. We're not saying that's going to happen overnight. We're just saying that these are live discussions within government about how we continue that roadmap out of here and get back to something that resembles normality.
Well, we have to talk to Nadhim Zahawi a bit more in detail about that later on. Chris Hobson, there's another story about the health service in the Mirror today, and that is about doctors feeling burnt out and indeed leaving.
Yeah, I think one of the things we really mustn't underestimate is the degree of pressure that the last 18 months has brought on the NHS. I mean, we were already having a very, very stretched workforce before we hit COVID. We had 100,000 staff vacancies. And what we're now finding is that for some of our staff, this 18 months on top of all of that is being very, very difficult. And I think what it does point to, Sophie, is that we have to have a long-term workforce plan for the NHS. There is, and the debate is starting this week, so it's very topical. The Health and Care Bill has moved to the House of Lords, and what's really important is that the government should accept an amendment that's coming into the House of Lords to ensure that we get a long-term workforce planning. Otherwise, we're going to have more and more burnt-out doctors, more and more burnt-out nurses, more and more burnt-out frontline staff. We have to get the right number of people in the NHS providing the care that's needed, so we don't give our staff an impossible workload day in, day out.
Let's move on, Caroline, to the front page of the Mail. And this is this interview, this exclusive with Lord Frost, the former Brexit minister. Be a true Tory, Boris. What do you make of that?
Well, we saw just before Christmas the Brexit Secretary resigned. He stated in his resignation letter a number of reasons why he didn't want to do the job anymore. He seemed to be disaffected, really, with the direction of travel from the Conservative Party and indeed the Prime Minister. And this really is a rallying cry to the Prime Minister not to forget his traditional Tory roots. And within that, really, his main concern is taxation, that this is no longer a party of low taxation. It's certainly an issue that's raised time and time again on the backbenches, who are very unhappy about the national insurance rise that we're about to see, particularly when we seem to be facing a cost of living crisis, which is already going to hurt families with larger energy bills. So this is him really saying to the Prime Minister, don't forget where you came from, don't squander your victory on Brexit, don't squander your majority and end up losing the next election by not being what you need to be, which is true to your Tory values.
We're going to move on now, Chris Hobson, to other news. I suppose it involves vaccination, but Novak Djokovic and the tennis, an extraordinary scene down in Australia still surrounding this tennis star. Tell us your story today.
Yeah, I was really intrigued, actually, Sophie, by the phrase that was used at the top of the page in The Sun, which was crack down on vaccine dodgers. And I think what's really interesting is that this prefigures a conversation we're going to need to have as a nation over the next 12 to 18 months, whereby if we still have significant numbers of people who are refusing to have a vaccination, that could potentially lead to us having to introduce restrictions that actually affect the whole nation. And how we strike this balance between, on the one hand, individual liberties and people being able to make a decision that says, no, I don't want a vaccine, but on the other hand, that having an impact that affects all of us. There is, I think, going to be a really interesting debate, and you're seeing it happening in France with some of the things that President Macron's been saying over the last week. There's going to be a really interesting debate about how we balance these two things, given the fact that as we go forward, there is potentially going to be an issue that if people don't get fully vaccinated, then the rest of us may have to endure things that we don't want to endure. And how you strike that balance seems really important.
And the pictures in The Sun also, talking of Novak Djokovic, focusing on, there's confusion about the dates there, isn't there? Because the reason his lawyers are now giving is that he had COVID on December the 16th. He tested positive, yet the papers have got lots of pictures of him on the 17th of December out with a lot of kids.
Well, and I think there's a running theme here, isn't there, that we've been seeing over the last few months, which is those who are in the public eye, those who lead us in terms of those who are political leaders, but also those who are sporting icons, who are setting an example. Their personal behaviour is really, really important. And it's really interesting talking to Trust chief executives. They're really clear that what they can't do is ask their staff to do one thing and then actually behave in a very different way themselves personally.
OK, we're going to move on to a non-COVID story here. The Old Master. I love stories like this. There's a wonderful story in The Observer about this old master that was bought for, was it £75?
Yes, £65, I think.
£65.
Yeah, no, this is a great story. It's the kind of thing we all wish would happen to us, really, which is that you suddenly buy something and you think it's a bargain, £65, and then you later find out that it's actually possibly a masterpiece worth £1 million. But it's interesting that this was actually bought by a very experienced art dealer who hadn't noticed, really, that it was worth so much money.
And finally, I've got to finish with the football, Chris. I know you're a big football fan, but there's a wonderful photograph on the front of the Sunday Times as Newcastle is beaten by Cambridge United. The look on Amanda Staveley's face.
Yeah, I mean, I am a big football fan. I'm a West Ham fan, and this weekend is always an interesting one. The words Hereford United are seared upon my memory from 1974. They're also seared on Newcastle United's fans' memories from 1972. They now have another set of names that are going to be seared on their memory. And I think what's Cambridge United, and I think what's particularly interesting is the money flowing into football actually these days really does mean that if you've made business decisions to buy football clubs and it doesn't go well, incidents like this, then actually, you know, it's quite potentially quite an issue. So yes, I'm hoping that Leeds United this afternoon we will progress to the fourth round. So
and we won't be seeing photos like that. Chris Hobson, thank you very much. Caroline Wheeler, thank you both very much for joining me. Now over to the weather, and Matt Taylor is here, and I can see out the window here. It is absolutely beautiful today.
It is. Doesn't it make a change from yesterday, Sophie? And it's the same across many parts of the UK this morning. This scene from our weather watcher in North Yorkshire, but it's not everywhere. We've got some showers around at the moment in the west, some sleet, some hill snow mixed in as well. The bulk of the showers, western Scotland, Northern Ireland, where they will be throughout this morning, early afternoon. But into the afternoon, they're going to spread into Northern England a bit more widely. Away from that, though, only isolated showers. Many will spend the bulk, if not all day, dry with some sunshine. Although later on, Channel Islands, Devon, Cornwall, the cloud increases, patchy rain. Something milder trying to push in. For the rest, it's going to be another fresh day out there. Temperature's not far off the average for this stage in January. But as the showers fade, clear skies first half of the night. Frost quickly developing, -6 for a time in eastern parts of Scotland. But temperatures rise through the night as the cloud gradually increases from the west, bringing some patchy rain or drizzle. An isolated frost to start your Monday morning commute across some eastern areas, but 8 to 10 degrees in the west, where it's going to be quite a murky, misty day around hills and coasts, patchy rain or drizzle. Some light rain or drizzle push eastwards across England, although the far east of the country will stay dry with some hazy sunshine. Heaviest of the rain, northwest Scotland, where we'll see gales develop later in the day, but a big change in temperature lifting up a little bit across the UK, double figures to the south and the west. And through the rest of the week, Sophie, other than some patchy rain in the south on Tuesday, a lot of the time will be dry. Back to you.
Matt, thank you very much. Now, there is a perfect storm brewing this spring. The cost of living is set to soar. Inflation could rise to as much as 7%. There's a national insurance hike to pay for the NHS and social care. And on top of all that, energy bills are about to rise, and by a lot, up to £700 potentially for the ordinary family. The respected Institute for Fiscal Studies says for people on average earnings, it could well be worse than the financial crisis. Well, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is with me now. Good morning.
Good morning, Sophie.
Do you agree with the IFS? Could it be worse than the financial crisis?
Well, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Resolution Foundation are pointing to some pretty staggering numbers for the hit on working people, £1,200 worse off a year. And the increase in gas and electricity prices is a big part of that, potentially going up by as much as £700 in April. And the problem is that so much of this has been caused by more than a decade now of dither and delay on energy policy by the government. Of course, there is a global spike in prices, but the UK are uniquely exposed because of a failure to properly insulate our homes, a failure to get on with the investment in nuclear, in hydrogen and in renewables, a decision, a crazy decision, to get rid of our gas storage facilities, and a failure to regulate the market properly. And that's why Labour are setting out a package of measures today to help people with their bills now, but also to properly reform this market so never again are we in this position.
And one of those measures is, as you have already spoken of, dropping the 5% VAT on fuel bills. A blunt tool, as the Prime Minister says.
Well, the Prime Minister, of course, was the biggest advocate of cutting VAT on gas and electricity bills when he was campaigning in the European
why do you want to do it?
referendum. I want to cut that VAT on gas and electricity bills because it will save people £100 a year on their bills. And we know that pensioners, for example, who have to stay in more, who need their homes more heated more warmly, for families who are already struggling with the cost of living crisis, spend a higher proportion of their
Absolutely.
incomes
And then
on those bills. And so this is a practical thing that government could do right now to help people through this difficult time.
But it will help a lot of people. It won't just help the people who need it. So why make it broad brush? Why drop it for everybody when actually the people who have the biggest houses, the biggest energy bills are going to get more money back?
Well, let me tell you about the whole package of measures then.
But why that specifically? Because that is the point, isn't it? It is a blunt tool. Why drop it for everybody? You always say, the broadest shoulders should carry the most. Why make it so broad here and allow people who don't really need the money to get all the money
Everybody
back?
is experiencing a rise of their gas and electricity bills now, and this is something practical that the government could do, and it would be felt immediately. But in addition to that, we are also massively increasing the warm homes discount to £400 a year and expanding the number of people who are eligible to that to 9 million people.
I just want to ask you about the 5% though. Do you not agree that it is too wide? It needs to be more narrow. It needs to help specifically the people who need it, so why give it to everybody?
What is needed is something for everybody who has experienced a rise in their bills, but then targeted additional support at those people who are struggling most. So the package of measures that I'm announcing today would result in £200 off the bills for everybody, but up to £600 off the bills of those people on the most modest incomes, including families with children and pensioners who are struggling most of all with the rise in those bills.
It's going to cost a lot to fund, and it is the VAT cut alone will cost almost £2 billion, which is my point. Why not make it just target the people who need it the most?
Well, the increase in the warm homes discount is at a cost of £3.5 billion. So you can see within that package of measures that the most support is being targeted at those on the lowest incomes. But the point about VAT, it is something immediate and practical the government could do right now. And the Prime Minister previously was a big advocate of this. It would make such a big difference now. And the fact is that his broken promises will not pay people's bills in April. The government should honour their own commitment and reduce that gas and electricity VAT right now from 5% to 0%. I first called for it on this programme, its previous incarnation, in October. The government have had 3 months.
So you're not worried, though?
Nothing.
You're not worried that people with a lot of money and people who have high energy bills are actually going to do rather well out of it? Are you worried about that or not?
Well, we are proposing an increase in the warm homes discount to give particular target to everybody. But the truth is, people on average incomes are also really worried right now about their gas and electricity bills. Going up by £600-700, that is going to affect everybody. I believe that everybody needs support right now.
You're also calling, like the Liberal Democrats did last week as well, for a windfall tax on energy companies. Is that not? It's a windfall tax. It is a one-off. This is a long-term problem that we are potentially in.
So let me say 2 things on that. First of all, it is really important that any chancellor or shadow chancellor who's proposing increases in spending can say where the money is going to come from. And that's why we are proposing that those North Sea oil and gas companies who are going to be making record profits this year because of that big spike in gas and electricity prices pay a bit more in tax to keep bills down for everybody else. But I recognise, Sophie, that these problems are not just of 1 year and that we need proper reform to the market, which is why at Labour Party conference I set out a £28 billion a year climate investment pledge, working with Ed Miliband to ensure that we retrofit homes to properly insulate homes and to bring forward investment in nuclear and hydrogen and renewables, so we're not so reliant on imported gas.
But that's very long term, isn't it? It's going to take a long time. Even Keir Starmer said that would be to 2031. I just want to talk about this windfall. But the windfall tax is interesting.
Let me just come back on that.
Who exactly are you going to tax?
Well, first of all, let me say that we could be retrofitting 2 million homes a year to make them properly insulated. That would take off £400 from someone's bill, not just for 1 year, but for years after that as well. And the government's dither and delay over the last decade means that we have not been building homes to a zero carbon standard, and we've not been insulating.
And that is my point. It is a long-term problem.
So let's get on with tackling those problems with a proper plan to invest in nuclear and renewables, to insulate our homes and to regulate the market market properly, because in no other country have you seen 27 firms go bust and those costs being transferred to bill payers.
It's not going to help the average person, though, who has, a year ago, they were £1,000 for their energy bills. They could this year be facing £2,000. We need a short-term solution, at least. We need to smooth the shock.
Yeah.
Is the windfall tax, a one-off windfall tax, going to do that? Or do you not need something in the short term which is far more sustainable?
So there's two parts of the announcement today. The first is the immediate help to people on their bills this year because of this huge spike in prices, which everyone you talk to in the energy market say that this is a once-in-a-generation type spike, but also recognising there are big problems in our energy market. We are too reliant on the Russians, for example, for our basic gas needs. We need to wean ourselves off that imported gas by investing in renewables, in hydrogen, in nuclear, but also insulating our homes. So I don't think it is just about short-term fixes, which is why in the package of measures that I've set out today...
Isn't it? That's what people are going to want. People who are really struggling to pay their bills.
£200 off bills for everybody, an additional £400 for those who need it most, paid for by a windfall tax on the North Sea oil and gas companies, but recognising that we've got to sort out the problems in our energy market with a whole package of longer-term reforms that this government have ducked.
What about national insurance, the national insurance rise? Would you reverse that?
Well, we said that we wouldn't have done it, and the government
has still got time.
Well, the government has still got time. As Jacob Rees-Mogg has pointed out, the government has still got a chance to reverse it, and we would do that. We would not be going ahead with this increase in April.
So a Labour government would reverse that?
We would, if we were in government, we would not be going ahead with it now. And I would just say that the government still have a chance to act. The government can do the right thing. There is another fiscal statement from the Chancellor set for the 23rd of March, just over a week before this tax increase is due to come in. I want the government, I want the Chancellor to rethink. The Chancellor has to be dragged kicking and screaming to every announcement he makes, but you've now got a chorus of Conservative MPs as well as the Labour Party saying, do the right thing, think again on national insurance, because this double whammy of a national insurance hike at the same time that gas and electricity bills are going to be going through the roof is just a catastrophe that families and pensioners cannot afford right now.
Can I ask you one question about coronavirus? Interesting to hear Mark Drakeford, the Labour Welsh First Minister, calling England a global outlier. Keir Starmer didn't call for restrictions for COVID here. Was Mark Drakeford right, or was Keir Starmer wrong?
Well, there are a number of things that we still think the government need to be doing to tackle coronavirus.
But who was right? I mean, who is right? Should Keir Starmer didn't want more restrictions to come in England? Mark Drakeford says England is a global outlier for not bringing them in. Who is right?
Well, I think there is more that government could be doing. Mark Drakeford is right on that, and Keir Starmer has been calling for increase in statutory sick pay to get ventilation sorted in schools. I mean, the proposal today that lateral flow tests are no longer going to be free. And these are absolutely the wrong policies and the wrong approach at the wrong time. The best way to stop further restrictions, and I do not want to see further restrictions to our life and to our economy, is to ensure that people can test and test regularly to stop passing on the virus. And that's why we believe that those lateral flow tests have got to remain free whilst we have huge numbers of cases on a daily basis.
Rachel Reeves, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Well, it is only 6 weeks ago that the Omicron variant was first detected, and since then it has swept around the world. As we heard in the paper review, Manchester and the northwest of England are currently facing the highest rates of infection and hospitalisation in the UK, but Omicron first took hold in London. And King's College was one of the first hospitals to experience it. I've been talking to its chief executive, Professor Clive Kay, about how severe it has been and the lasting impact on his staff. So this is a COVID ward.
Yes, yes.
These masks, it's really different wearing one of these, isn't it? It's actually quite hard to breathe.
Yes, and imagine wearing them for many hours at a time. So this is an acute respiratory ward, COVID positive patients.
So these are all patients who are in here, who have come in here because they have COVID, or who have acquired it on the way?
A combination. They're patients who have acute respiratory problems who are COVID positive.
And how busy is it?
It's pretty busy. It's not quite as frenetic and as busy as it was during the previous waves, but nonetheless, it's busy.
I wouldn't be telling the truth if I said, as we headed into
the Christmas just gone, staff were happy with the situation. They were really not. And they were really hoping that there would not be another wave, another Christmas ruin.
Do you think you'll lose staff?
So I think in the short term, hopefully we'll be okay. I think in the medium to long term, there will be an impact on staff. Some of the things they've seen, some things they've experienced, some of the things they've had to go through, I think will last a very, very long time, if not forever. And I do fear that some of them will decide that actually they don't want to stay.
Do you think hospitals will ever be overwhelmed, given what you've already been through?
I don't think you can ever say never. I think there is a risk, to be fair. I think what we really need to help us in terms of COVID is to encourage as many of the public to be vaccinated as they possibly can. So if they're double vaccinated, to get their booster. If they're not vaccinated, it's never too late, because we know, apart from, of course, all the various public health measures, that is making a difference and has made a huge difference. I think had we not had the vaccination programme in place, we would here at King's have been close to being overwhelmed, yes.
You're encouraging the public to be vaccinated. Your staff
Yes.
are being forced to be vaccinated by law by April. Do you think that's
Yes.
right, to have mandatory vaccination?
So they're not being forced to be, just to be really clear, they're not being forced and it's not mandatory. They're being encouraged. And it will be a condition of deployment. Well, there's a possibility if they choose not to be vaccinated, they could be redeployed. And if we can't find that opportunity to redeploy them, yes, then the consequence is that they will.
But it is either have your vaccination or lose your job. But your hospital, people may well have seen, the health secretary was here last week, and a consultant, a critical care consultant, confronted him.
You're not happy with it, tell me.
No. So I would be dismissed if I don't have a vaccine. It's not, the science isn't strong enough.
You were there.
Indeed so.
How did you feel about hearing that for a start?
So I think, of course, so my personal view as an individual, but certainly in terms of my role as Chief Executive of King's College Hospital, is to encourage our staff to be vaccinated. And myself, my colleagues, we've been doing that since the vaccination programme started, and we'll continue to do that. But we will not make individuals be vaccinated. We must treat them with kindness, with compassion. We must give them every single opportunity to talk through if they don't want the vaccine, if they'd like to talk, if they need any help or clarification. But ultimately, it is their choice. And I'm not going to comment on individual cases, obviously, Sophie, but the reality is, if ultimately, at the end of the day, an individual fully informed, and we feel we've done all our very best to encourage them to have the vaccinations, and they've decided not to, that is their choice.
Do you think it's fair, though?
I think the reality is, whether I think it's fair or not is a moot point. The law is now such that individuals who are not vaccinated, if they can't be redeployed, will not be able to work in hospitals if they deal with patients.
You've got about 10% of your staff currently who haven't been vaccinated, so they've got a month to do so, to have their first vaccine.
Yeah.
How many staff could you potentially lose? What is 10% of your staff if they don't have it?
So overall, we have approximately 14,000 staff at King's. But I am confident.
So more than 1,000, you could lose more than 1,000 staff.
Well, at an extreme position. But I am confident that, and we're already seeing a number of staff choosing to be vaccinated. We're having conversations with staff, their line managers are having conversations. We have a helpline where colleagues can contact and seek clarification help. So I don't want at this stage to predict or give any numbers. I think the reality is, over the next several weeks, we'll need to make sure, and we'll continue to make sure, on a daily basis, every single member...
You must be worried about that. I mean, that is a large number. You must be worried about the impact that could have.
Yeah, of course. I think we have to... My job is to worry. My job is to worry about everything in relation to whether or not we have enough staff here to provide care for patients safely, and we'll continue to do so, and we will provide care for patients. But ultimately, if individuals choose not to, this is their choice, it's their personal choice.
And if you lose that number of staff, what impact will that have on your hospital?
I think, of course, it will very much depend on which clinical areas the staff are working in, and the numbers are affected, and we'll have to address that as we pass through the coming weeks and work through those issues and work out who's impacted and which clinical areas, and we'll reorganise as we need to.
Will we ever go back to normal?
Depends what normal is, I suppose. I think there will be a new normal. We have to make sure that whatever service we provide, ultimately, quality-wise, and particularly in relation to the safety of the treatments we're delivering, are just as good as those we were delivering before.
And in terms of your new normal, it does sound like there will be a lot more off-site virtual treatment. Patients will not be happy with that, will they? A lot of people will not like that. They will feel that that is a lesser service.
Yeah, I think part of our redesigning the clinical pathway for patients, innovating, transforming the way we deliver care does not necessarily mean that will be an inferior treatment.
Not necessarily, but it could.
Well, it could, and of course, if it did mean that, we would try to think of a different way of doing it. And I think also, what I think we haven't been really good at over the years in the NHS is we've attempted to push a kind of one-size-fits-all. And there are some of the population who would be very keen on virtual appointments and not having to come into hospital, not having to sit around in outpatient areas, and others who might prefer to have face-to-face. So I think we need to kind of create a menu almost of different and new ways of treating, diagnosing, seeing, reviewing, treating patients, and almost in a bespoke way provide that care for patients. And I think there's a possibility we can do that.
Do you think you've reached the peak here?
Well, I'm not superstitious, but I hope so. We're doing all we can to reduce the potential for Omicron to spread in the hospital. Patients having to, we ask patients to wear masks.
Do you think you're doing enough? I mean, that is your task, isn't it, to manage that?
Yeah,
and there are people who come into hospital and get COVID in hospital. And in earlier waves, in some trusts, it was sort of 1 in 4 people who were in hospital are caught it in hospital.
Yeah, I mean, so we are still having surgery take place for patients who don't have COVID, and they are tested before they come in. We ask visitors to take tests. For those who now are allowed in to visit, we ask inpatient visitors to wear PPE. Our staff test themselves regularly. So I don't think, I mean, at the end of the day, health is a people business. So, we have to have people in the organisation. I think we have reduced as far as we possibly can. It's a bit like running a race and not knowing where the finishing line is. So that is what is particularly difficult.
But you seem to think that you can see the finishing line now.
I hope we can see the finishing line, and it's the single and only finishing line, but I'm not certain.
Professor Clive Kay there. Well, she was one of the greatest stars of the golden age of Hollywood. Ava Gardner worked with all the legendary directors and shared top billing with the likes of Humphrey Bogart, Clark Gable, Burt Lancaster and Richard Burton. Her private life was as famed as her films. She was a hellraiser who won and broke the heart of Frank Sinatra. A new stage play about her, adapted by the actor and Downton Abbey star Elizabeth McGovern, opens this month in London, and I'm delighted to say that Elizabeth joins me now. Good morning, lovely to see you.
Good morning to you.
And you are not only starring in this, you have written the script as well. Tell us about it.
It was a book that was on my shelf and I just chanced upon one day. And I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to write a biography, because it was a book about a guy trying to write a biography and struggling with his subject, who was sometimes very enthusiastic about sharing her stories and other times very unenthusiastic. So I thought, well, this is very interesting just to explore the whole idea of what is a biography. How are they created? What are the choices you make when you leave things in or include things in a life story? Who owns a life story? And so I just started with that idea and went on from there.
And Ava Gardner, this wonderful, beautiful, glamorous Hollywood star who I think even Elizabeth Taylor had called the most beautiful woman in the world. When you write about her, your play, she is in her 60s, she's had a stroke, she's come from America, she's now living in London, and she's talking to this biographer, but she's a very different person. She's stooped, she's wearing a tracksuit.
She's had a stroke.
She's had a stroke, and it is an extraordinary story that she tells him, the life story.
Yes, one of the kind of magical things about being in the theatre is that between her and the biographer, they go back in time together, and he becomes various people in her life along the way. You'll have to come to the theatre to see how that happens. But we've also been very excited by the idea of using a lot of film language in the theatre, a lot of film techniques. We use a lot of film, we use a lot of sound. So I hope it's a visually very entertaining show, and also orally very entertaining.
You have a wonderful line in it. I've read the script, as you say, it's not open yet, so I haven't seen it, but when you get blown up so big, you end up paper thin. And to me, when reading it, it felt like a real reflection on Hollywood stardom, which has just gone wrong. I felt really sorry for her. Is that what you felt?
No. Well, I think that she wasn't a sad person. I think at the end of her life she felt that she had lived a great adventure, and indeed she had. And you'll see when you see the show, if you do, that there was no adventure she said no to.
Including a marriage to Frank Sinatra.
Indeed.
I mean, that was the great love affair, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, in some ways they invented this idea of the celebrity couple, and everybody was in love with their love affair. But of course that takes a toll on a couple to have to kind of perform their lives as well as live them. So that's explored in the play, the impact of fame and the kind of pressures that it brings to bear on a life.
I must talk to you as well. I mean, that's your first play, you're doing it on your own, very different to what we all know you for, which is Downton Abbey. You play Lady Cora. Let's watch a little bit of the new film, which is coming out shortly.
Oh, good.
Years ago, before you were born, I met a man, and now I've come into the possession of a villa in the south of France.
What?
3, 2, 1. They better be warned. The British are coming.
Wonderful. It is extraordinary, isn't it, what Downton Abbey has become, from a television series on ITV to this glossy films. It's the second one. Why is it? What is it that really connects with people?
I can only say that it's probably a connection to the characters and the escape. I think at this point, people are nostalgic not only for the era that Downton Abbey is in, but for the era that we were in when we first started watching the show and falling in love with the family and the servants and their dynamic. So it's a nostalgia for the time when it was first on the air. It's been around that long.
Wonderful. Well, Elizabeth McGovern, thank you very much for joining us, and
thank
good luck
for having me
with your first show of this kind.
Yes.
And Ava, The Secret Conversations opens at Riverside Studios in London on the 18th of January, and it runs until the middle of April. Now, my next guest is the Education Secretary, Nadhim Zahawi. It was back to school for millions of children across the UK last week, but already, like in hospitals, staffing is proving problematic because of Omicron. England has now fallen into line with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and recommended that pupils wear face masks in the classroom. Good morning, Nadhim Zahawi. Thank you very much for joining us. Can we first of all talk about COVID and specifically the story that's on the front of the papers this morning, cutting the isolation time from 7 days until 5 days. That is what you want.
So the UK Health and Security Agency has done a really good blog on this, and I was asked in the interview in the Sunday Times what I thought of it. The important thing to remember is our isolation period, because sometimes we get compared with America because they're on 5 days, we're on 7 days. We start isolating for when you get symptoms. They begin isolating when you get a positive test. So the caveat around this is the UK Health and Security Agency says if you cut it down to below 7 days, you might see a higher spike, but they're going to review it. The reason I think it's important that we keep it under review is because obviously it would help with staff absenteeism. Hence why I think if the experts, and I have to defer to the UK Health and Security Agency, deem it appropriate that you can have 2 negative tests on consecutive days, as we do now with day 6 and 7, then it's a good thing to keep under review, and that's exactly what they're doing, and they have a blog on this.
But you would like that to happen sooner rather than later. It would certainly help. It
would certainly help, of course. I had I was probably the first cabinet minister before Christmas to have a sort of call to arms for retired teachers to come forward, and it was great to see a number of my colleagues, Jonathan Gullis, Caroline Ansell, Sir Michael Wilshaw, a number of civil servants in my department come forward. Teach First, over 100 of their alumni have come forward, and of course we'll see this week, and we'll publish it this week, how many more, because we talk to the supply agencies all the time. The biggest supply agencies have told us hundreds have come forward, which is really great to see. And I was at Hammersmith Academy last week to see how they've coped with testing, because we've asked all secondary school pupils to be tested at school, and they've done brilliantly. And it's actually
So you've got hundreds who've come forwards, but you have thousands of staff who are off at the moment.
So at the end of last term, staff absenteeism was at about 8%. Last week we were at about 8.5%, so we didn't see a massive spike. That will increase, no doubt, because obviously that now schools are back. You're going to see an increase in infection rates.
What about staff absenteeism, because they've only just gone back to school? So what about now, after the end of the first week, how many staff are off?
So that's what I was saying, 8.5% is what we saw now, compared to 8% before.
And teaching unions say that you're planning for up to 25% to be off.
We have to make plans for every outcome. That's the responsible thing to do. At the moment, we're seeing it at 8.5%. That could rise. I'm talking to my school commissioners, and last week's review said actually some schools have had higher than that, up to 40% absent. They still maintained their ability to open for face-to-face education, which is great. We want to learn from them. But I have to have contingency plans for 10, 15, 20, 25% absenteeism, because obviously Omicron is far more infectious. The good news is that although hospitalisation is rising, ICU, people who are severely ill with Omicron, is coming down in the ICU numbers. Of course, we know that it is the booster that has made the real difference, sort of that decoupling between infection rates and serious infection, hospitalisation and death is because of the booster. As of next week, Monday, we go back into schools to do more vaccination, and 16, 17-year-olds are now able to get their booster. So please get boosted. By the way,
but 90%. Let me talk about
Sure.
school boosters,
Sure.
school vaccinations, because before you set out plans. I mean, the NHS wanted to get the vast majority of 12 to 15-year-olds vaccinated by the October half term. As of now, it's still only, 49, 50%? That has been too slow, hasn't it?
So we are over 50%, so over 1.2 million 12 to 15-year-olds have had the vaccine.
But nowhere near as far as you wanted to.
We have to go much, much faster, which is why we're going back into schools on Monday with the school-age vaccination programme. But also...
Why has it been so difficult, though? Because you did promise a majority by October half term, and we're now in January.
So one of the things the NHS did at the end of last year is open the system so parents can book an appointment online and take them to a vaccination centre or to a GP. I saw some reports saying, GPs won't vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds. That's actually not true. You can actually book and take your son or daughter to a vaccination centre and get that vaccination. It's important that people do that. This is the way we're going to transition this virus from pandemic to endemic. I think we are on that road. This is a big bump on the road. The next 2 weeks will be bumpy because obviously staff absenteeism will rise as students go back into education. But on the whole, this has been a good start last week. This week will be important. 99% of primary schools are open, over 90% of secondaries. Some of them
open doesn't necessarily mean fully open, does it? I mean, open means you could be open and just have 2 classes there.
No, so when we get the data back, we're analysing it. So some are staggering. The secondary school are staggering their opening. Why? Because of the testing we've asked them to do, and they were able to obviously order the test kits. We delivered 31 million test kits. We'll deliver another 17 million this week.
How many schools are actually completely closed?
So in primary, 99.9 are open, are reporting that they're open.
What about secondary?
Secondary, we think we're at about 90% open, but of course that's
so
part
10% of schools are closed?
No, that's the whole thing. When we go back and look at the data, actually some of them are reporting that they're closed, but what they're doing is a staggered opening. So about 1%, 1.2% were still closed as of last week. So that means, you know, we're doing well. We've still got this week to go. We've got universities coming back as well, and I'm really grateful to students who are 90% vaccinated. And by the way, one really amazing stat is in the population for 12 and above, 90% now have had at least one dose. So we had lots of people who've never had a vaccine come forward and take a vaccine.
It's interesting. It's interesting, this picture that you're painting, though, the uncertainty for the next couple of weeks, certainly in schools, and what is going to happen, because you don't know, nobody really knows how the Omicron wave is going to affect the rest of England, the rest of the country. We've got exams coming up. Can you really guarantee that exams this year, they haven't happened for the last 2 years, can you guarantee, a cast iron guarantee, that exams will happen?
So obviously, with a virus like COVID and now with a variant like Omicron, we have to plan for all sorts of contingencies. The one thing I would say is exams in January, and we've got vocational exams happening in January, are going ahead because those students have studied hard and they're going to be able to do it. If they are, isolating with Omicron, then they should be contacting their awarding organisations to have another date. In the summer, we will be going ahead with GCSEs and A-levels. On the 7th of February, we'll be giving schools, teachers, school leaders more information as to what those exams will entail, because we recognise that those students sitting their GCSEs or A-levels have had their education disrupted, which is why we're making that information available, that additional information, 7th of February. We're going further and working with Ofqual to say we do want to go back to pre-COVID grading and the sort of robustness of the grading system, but we're going to do it in 2 steps. So we're going to go to the mean between the self-assessment, the teacher assessment, forgive me, and the pre-COVID for this summer, and then we'll go to pre-COVID grading the year after. So we do it in 2 steps.
It sounds complicated. So
it is complicated, but
just for teachers and parents who are
yes.
sitting at home, is there a plan B, or is there just plan A? Pupils will sit those exams.
Well, I'm confident that between the boosting campaign,
I sense a hesitance
testing,
in your answer. That's all. I know, and there are a lot of teachers out there and parents who want to know.
There's always contingency planning, because
so there is
we know with COVID, there are always variants. We keep a close eye on it. I'm certainly confident that we are on a path towards transitioning this thing from pandemic to endemic. But you've got to make contingency plans. My absolute commitment is that exams are going ahead, both this January and for the summer for GCSEs and A-levels, but we're putting in mitigations to make sure that we recognise that those students have had their education disrupted.
That sounds like a plan B to me.
Well, as I said, we make plans all the time because that is responsible.
It could change, like it did last year.
So that's a responsible thing to do. Unlike
it's just for certainty.
But unlike Labour, the Shadow Health Secretary on the 19th of December, just before Christmas, says we've got to go harder and lock down harder. In the new year, he says, isn't it great that we didn't lock down?
I'm not talking about Labour, talking about exams.
I'm just saying to you that you as a responsible government, you have to make sure you always have mitigations and play out different scenarios. I will do everything in my power, and I'm confident the teaching profession, head teachers, by the way, the support staff, big shout out to the support staff, because without them, as I saw at Hammersmith Academy, we couldn't open schools and test those students, and they did brilliantly.
Let's talk about...
We will do this, and we'll do it together, because as in every stage of this pandemic, the British people and that Dunkirk spirit comes through, and we come together, including retired teachers, and make sure that we deliver the best outcomes for kids. And the best outcome is face-to-face education in school, in college and in university.
You're talking about face-to-face education. There are a lot of school children in classrooms right now who are finding face-to-face education somewhat harder because they're having to wear masks. Is there really proof that that is necessary?
Not for a day longer than that necessary.
Is there proof that it's necessary?
So I released the evidence. We looked at the evidence from the UK Health and Security Agency. We looked at evidence from SAGE. We looked at our own observational study of 123 schools. Hear me out.
It was inconclusive,
wasn't it? You have to caveat it because it hasn't been peer reviewed. That's what we said. But because Omicron is a quantum more infectious than Delta, I felt it was the right thing to do based on the evidence, but I don't want to see masks in the classroom for a day longer than is necessary. And on the 26th of January, we'll review that, and I hope we'll be able to take it away.
But the evidence that there is there, that it makes any difference, and this is when the report, the review that you did, is when before Omicron, wasn't it? So it was with the Delta, and it said that absence fell by 0.6 percentage points more in secondary schools that used face masks. 0.6%. Is it really worth making secondary school pupils?
That's still thousands of pupils.
It's a tiny number, though, and you don't even know.
Those are kids, and that's their future. All I'm saying to you,
it's a very small number, and it is very difficult for children, for teachers to teach, for children to learn. When they are covered, they have their face mask, their face covered all the time.
So the teachers don't have to wear the face mask. They're standing at the front of the class teaching, and I saw them doing a brilliant job at Hammersmith Academy. The students tell me that actually, you know, if it means they can stay in education, the Children's Commissioner, Rachel D'Souza, did a brilliant survey. 500,000 children responded. And actually, this is not a snowflake generation. They are resilient, but they said they want to be back at school because it was impacting their mental health and their education. If this is a small thing, as part of a larger set of mitigations, including 350,000 CO2 monitors, 8,000 air purifiers for those classrooms. I know what you're going to say.
Yes, I know, but that is a tiny number. There are 24,000 schools, and you've got 8,000 purifiers. But
right, let's go through this.
No, we don't need to go through that.
Because it's unfair. I sent out 350,000 CO2 monitors deliberately. That cost £25 million. Why? So I can know which classrooms actually can't mitigate easily, which is why we got the modelling says we need about 8,000 for those classrooms that can't mitigate. We are stewards of public money. It's only right. Instead of buying 350,000 air purifiers that we don't need, because on the whole, most classrooms were okay. The data we're getting from the CO2 monitors, which 350,000 went out.
And a lot of teachers are just, all they're doing actually is opening the windows. Let's just talk about the masks though, because I'm sure at Hammersmith Academy when you went, they were all wearing their masks, but there are a lot of teachers who are struggling with pupils who are not wearing their masks. What should a teacher do if a pupil doesn't wear a mask?
So my very strong advice is we trust the teachers. We trust the head teachers to do the right things. In some cases, with special educational needs children or other children who can't wear the mask, then the teachers will be able to make that decision. In every case, we have to trust the teachers to do the right thing. This is a short-term mitigation, one of a number, the most important of which obviously is the vaccination, and then the booster, of course, and the testing. We are, by the way, we used to buy about 100 million tests a month. In January this month, it's 425 million lateral flow devices coming in.
And that is costing a fortune, isn't it? I mean, lateral flow tests, when do we stop making lateral flow tests free? It's costing about £6 billion a year. Should that stop now?
So I saw that story this morning in the Sunday Times. I don't recognise that. We are looking to continue
that was an interview you did with Caroline Wheeler.
But that bit, because it was her and another journalist. That bit was not from me.
So you're not calling for an end to free lateral flow tests?
We are not calling to an end to free lateral flow tests because actually there are 3 lines of defence. Number 1 is vaccine and booster. Number 2 is testing, which is why we've got 425 million lateral flow tests coming in for January and more to come after that, because that's how you deal with Omicron. And number 3 is antivirals and therapeutics. And we've got, Sajid Javid has ordered over 5 million of those. We are the most open economy in Europe. The way we've managed that, unlike what Labour wanted to do, which is lock down before Christmas, is by boosting,
lateral flows
and therapeutics.
And Labour didn't want to lock down before Christmas.
We're streeting.
They didn't call for...
Play it again. We're streeting on the 19th of December said if you act fast and hard, you do better. Actually advocating for a stronger lockdown.
They didn't say lockdown. Anyway,
you can check the interview, Sophie.
Okay.
He was saying he was advocating for stronger lockdowns. In the new year, he said, isn't it wonderful that we didn't lock down?
Can I just ask you about vaccination? And I was in a hospital just yesterday talking to the chief executive about mandatory vaccination for staff, and he fears there is a possibility that he loses about 1,400, 10% of his staff because they're not vaccinated. Do you think that should be reversed?
So I think that when you work with the most vulnerable people, and those going into hospital are very vulnerable, as are those in adult social care in our care homes, you have a duty of care. When I talk to the doctors and nurses when I was the vaccine deployment minister, they say to me, literally, the majority that we have a duty of care. Surgeons do it for hepatitis. They get vaccinated before they can practice surgery. I think it's the right thing. We know that the vaccines cut the infection rate down. That is a fact, right? I've heard...
So it's correct.
It is
right
correct. We have a duty of care to the most vulnerable. We know that a number of people... I lost my uncle to COVID, right? And I don't know whether he contracted in hospital or out, but he was in and out of hospital. Sadly, he was eligible for a vaccine, but we couldn't get him vaccinated and got infected, right? There are families whose husbands, wives, grandparents got infected in hospital. We have a duty of care when we're looking after the most vulnerable to protect ourselves and protect them.
Nadhim Zahawi, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
And that is it from us on the new Sunday morning. I'll be back next week. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye.